So we are discussing the U.S. role in the Middle East in the age of coronavirus. As SETA Washington, we organized this event with General Mark Kimmitt and Mike Doran of Hudson Institute. So we appreciate their accepting this to speak in this event, and I think this is part of a series of events that we are trying to organize on the U.S. role globally, internationally, in the wake of the coronavirus. There's a lot of discussions about the U.S. Global role or their lack of it in terms of leadership in the coronavirus environment, and what's going to happen with the U.S. foreign policy going forward, what happens in the relations with China, what happens in the Middle East. In this session, we are focusing on the Middle East, and we feel privileged to have General Mark Kimmitt and Mike Doran to discuss these issues. I just want to start with General Kimmitt. He has recently authored a piece titled Is COVID-19 America's East of Suez Moment, which essentially warns against retreat from the region due to the economic toll of the coronavirus and the tendency in these post-crisis moments for the U.S. to try to reduce its regional footprint. General Kimmitt, perhaps you can start with sort of explaining that argument in that article and anything else you would like to say as an introduction. Please go ahead. Thank you.
First, Kadir, thanks for bringing this together. And it's always a pleasure to work with my good friend, Mike Doran. We have been joking with each other now for about the last 15 years. So any barbs at Mike are done with a great amount of affection and respect. I'm going to just read from this paper, a short version of the paper that I wrote regarding this presumptuous, this notion that somehow COVID-19 is going to change the world as we know. And I want to start with the historical analogy, the East of Suez decision that was made by the British in 1967. In 1967, Great Britain was facing huge trade deficits, declining productivity, increasing budget deficits, and a devaluation of the pound. The Labour Party Defence Review reduced the Minister of Defence budget to £2 billion. It scrapped aircraft carriers, economized on their NATO commitments, and increasingly relied on a strategy of nuclear deterrence. Another casualty of the review was the enormously expensive East of Suez policy. Military commitments in Bahrain, Yemen, Malaysia, and Hong Kong cost £330 million a year, as compared to only $250 million for its broad NATO commitments. Given the financial imperatives and increasing Soviet threat and repeated domestic guns and butter debate, the British took the difficult policy choice to withdraw British forces from Bahrain, Yemen, and Malaysia, all those areas of east of the Suez, marking the end of significant military commitments to both the Near and Far East, except for that of Hong Kong. Now, some of Mike Doran's fellow think tankers, such as Corey Shockey at AEI and Robert Kaplan at the Eurasia Group, suggest that COVID may push the U.S. into a similar East of Suez decision in the Middle East. Certainly, there are similarities between our situation and that faced by the British in '67. Like the British, the U.S. decision would be the convergence of a host of factors, and three stand out: waning public support for the cost and consequences of Middle East operations, fewer national interests in the region, and the extraordinary costs incurred by the U.S. government in the light of the COVID-19 pandemic. Diminishing public support for Middle East operations is not new. Since the election of Barack Obama in 2008 and Donald Trump in 2016, there's been little support for the foundational Carter Doctrine of 1980, which the U.S. committed to the use of military force to defend our interests in the Middle East. To Obama, the war in Iraq was a mistake from its outset, and Trump has been equally critical of deploying most forces from northern Syria, reducing troop commitments in Iraq, and pressing for a once unthinkable peace deal with the Taliban. His views were summed up in a comment on 6 April. We're wasting all our money in the Middle East. What we've done is so crazy. We're in the Middle East for $8 trillion, and if you want to fix a pothole on a highway, you can't. The national interests of the U.S. in the Middle East are far less existential than in years past. The U.S. is now self-sufficient in energy resources, and a significant warming of relations with Israel within the region has led to increased stability among former adversaries. Relative to the threats from China, from a revanchist Russia, and from a host of non-state actors, instability in the Middle East ranks far lower than in years past. The threat of significant terrorist attacks are diminished and have evolved dramatically as homegrown violent extremists, domestic violence extremists, are considered far more approximate. Some say the cost of the COVID-19 pandemic will be the inflection point. Like the UK in 1967, the financial price of the pandemic will likely cause a reassessment of national priorities. These costs are staggering. Some 22 million Americans filed for unemployment in the past 4 weeks, compared to the record in 1982 of only 700,000. 30 times more people have filed for unemployment than at the previous 1982 record. Tax revenues from individuals and corporations will be a fraction. Government programs to address this economic blow are estimated to range from $6 to $10 trillion, half the annual GDP of the US, and increase the national debt by at least 50%. Even when COVID-19 is no longer a health crisis, a follow-on economic crisis is inevitable. In light of this, government belt-tightening will be imperative, as it's unlikely that the economy will be able to grow its way out. Offsetting government expenditures will be obligatory, and military ops in the Middle East will almost certainly be a major target. Now, I wouldn't make the argument, I wouldn't set up a straw man unless I was ready to knock it down. And despite the obvious similarities to 67, it'd be rash to conclude that the pandemic is akin to Britain's financial collapse in the 1960s, or that COVID-19 marks an end to American involvement in the region, whether as a result of policies or pandemics. While it's true that enthusiasm for foreign wars has plummeted, support for world engagement in general and in the region is strong. But it's become fashionable to argue that the US is retrenching or withdrawing or abandoning the order. Few polls demonstrate that point. Even the recent calls for fewer immigrants or less dependence on foreign supply chains do not necessarily infer that Americans are becoming more isolationists. The desire for engagement may reflect a common sense realization that the Middle East still matters. While vital national interests in the region may be less so than in years past, the region is still important, still dangerous, and still threatens the US. Terrorist groups, while not as capable as Al-Qaeda or ISIS, are taking advantage of weak state control and metastasize into almost every country in the region. And more dangerously, they're exporting hardened fighters around the world. Oil is less important for the US, but is still needed by the rest of the world economy. State collapse is increasing as countries are experiencing massive population explosions and urbanization without the means to adequately address their consequences. Many would say, so what? Why is this a US problem to solve? And the answer is simple. If the pandemic has shown us anything, it's that two oceans and friendly neighbors can't keep out the rest of the world. What goes the argument, at what cost? What are the $8 trillion Trump said the US has squandered in the Middle East, which might have been spent on infrastructure, education, or healthcare? Look, while those sunk costs are significant, analysis of those costs recognize that an overwhelming percentage of them were operational: fuel, ammunition, life support, and those massive costs will abate significantly as extensive military operations conclude. What will remain are infrastructure and personnel, mostly rotational units, whose size will grow and shrink as needed, and whose annual costs are a fraction of the former conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. Additionally, further cost efficiencies will be achieved by the geographical offsetting through the use of drones controlled from Nevada, long-range air platforms, launched from Missouri and cyber ops conducted in Maryland, all of which can be shared among the other priority theaters. Unlike Great Britain in '68, whose withdrawal from Bahrain, Singapore, and Egypt and Yemen had little strategic impact, U.S. withdrawal from the region would reverberate worldwide. It would create a vacuum quickly filled by the Russians and the Chinese, and we would abandon long-standing allies to others, and without the stabilizing impact of a comprehensive U.S. effort, might ignite more regional conflict. Our withdrawal would lead energy resources, shipping routes, and alliances to those countries more willing to establish a presence in the region, and would certainly lead to decreased stability and increased threats to U.S. national interests. There'll be many that see the COVID-19 pandemic as a catalyst or an opportunity to reduce a robust U.S. presence in the Middle East. They might agree with President Trump's aspiration to let somebody else fight over this long, bloodied sand, or his view that U.S. needs to make difficult financial choices and potholes take priority. If few will dispute the numerous risks to U.S. national security, including terrorism, encroachment by Russia and China, regional conflicts, control of economically critical waterways, threat to allies, potential state collapse, threat from Iran, and a host of other seen and unseen challenges. It would be naive and dangerous to adopt the policy of retrenchment, as it would have the same impact on U.S. worldwide influence as it did in the United Kingdom. It was easier for the United Kingdom as they could count on the U.S. to fill the vacuum. But should the U.S. withdraw, the vacuum will not be filled by our allies. So maintaining a presence and influence in the region will require continued popular support, a willingness to protect American interests, and strong arguments in the face of other costly defense and security priorities. One can only hope that COVID-19 pandemic does not result in a self-defeating east of Suez policy for the U.S.
I'll take it that's your introduction, General Kimmitt.
That's all I'm going to say.
Good. Mike, as you heard, General Kimmitt is making a strong argument against retrenchment and retreat from the region. But, you know, because of the economic toll of COVID-19, we are going to have a lot more budgetary constraints. There will be pressures to reduce budgets, perhaps even of defense budget. Do you think, and Trump wants to bring troops home as well, and there was an agreement with Taliban in Afghanistan, for instance, to enable that, and then he wants to pull out of Iraq eventually as well. How do you see withdrawal discussions in line with what General just said about overall U.S. retrenchment from the retreat from the region, and what the implications might be of that?
Thanks, Kadir. Thanks for having me, and thanks, Mark. Thanks for joining me in this, and thanks for that very thought-provoking article, with which I am in large agreement. But I guess I would just emphasize a couple of specific points, and maybe quibble with a couple things with Mark. Let me start with the points that I would emphasize. I think that there are two results of this. There are going to be two results of this crisis that are very clear to me, and then some possibilities that are fuzzier. So the two things that I think are clear to me is, one, we're going to come out of this crisis with an intensified U.S.-China competition. I think that that we were moving in that direction anyway, and I think that now the dangers of this kind of open-ended engagement that we had with China, this kind of end of history expectation that we had that China was going to, through economic engagement with the West, was going to liberalize, and that we were going to be able to arrive at a strategic accommodation without having to really think long and hard about competition with China. I think all of that is going to be gone, and we're going to see ourselves in a very serious competition. How serious? It's not clear. It's not clear to me. I don't know that it's going to be an out-and-out Cold War like it was with the Soviet Union, but the competition with China is going to be a much clearer strategic principle for the United States, I think. The other thing that I think is obvious, to me at least, is that Iran is going to be severely weakened by this crisis. It already has been severely weakened. This crisis, on top of the maximum pressure campaign that Donald Trump has been conducting, I think that at no time I think this is the biggest crisis that the Iranian regime has ever had in its history. And I think at no time have we seen it so obviously weak. Now, the Iranians are very good at trying to make themselves look strong and unperturbable, and they're making an effort now. But for the first time, you can really see them openly making the effort to try to shore things up. And this crisis is hitting them at home and also abroad. They're losing legitimacy at home significantly, and that's on top of what we already saw. You know, in November we saw the worst protests that they have ever that the regime has ever experienced in every city, every ethnic group, every class of people was involved in those protests. That was totally unprecedented. And now we're seeing, I think, even within the regime's loyal base, we're seeing cracks, not severe cracks, but some cracks, and eroding legitimacy. Now, as for the United States, I agree with the general analysis of Mark, that a whole host of factors are going to keep us engaged in the Middle East, exactly as he said. But I do think that the pressures to pull back the American troop commitment are going to increase. And what I think is going to happen, or at least what I would argue should happen for sure, but I think it will. I think we can already see it happening, is that the U.S. is going to go back to a more traditional understanding of international politics as being a game of states and balancing states against states. Now, why do I put it that way? Because after 9/11 and then after the Arab Spring, the U.S. Started seeing non-state actors in some regards as more important to it than state actors. And no relationship suffered more from that conception than the U.S.-Turkish relationship, because the United States saw first Al-Qaeda and then the Islamic State as the major strategic problem in the region, and it turned to the YPG as the answer to that problem, and in the process undermined the strategic framework in which it had been operating with Turkey. As the U.S. is under increasing pressure to decrease its operations on the ground in the Middle East, and yet continues to see competition with countries like China as important to it, I think that it's going to rediscover the importance of the U.S.-Turkish relationship, and also just building a system of states, a coalition of states in the region that can help it to counterbalance China and look after those interests that are going to continue to be there that Mark described so eloquently.
Thank you, Mike. I just want to maybe clarify something. So if the U.S. will try to reduce the military footprint and come to realize the importance of state actors as opposed to sub-state actors, in that case, you wouldn't consider that uh, wouldn't that be more multilateralist? And Trump may not necessarily go that route. His instincts are more bilateral, one-on-one relationships.
Well, I think it would be, you know, in the Middle East, what does multilateralism mean? It always means uh, a uh, a series of intersecting bilateral U.S. relationships. So, you know, we're very familiar in this region that our allies don't get along with each other. So the three most important ones are by my reckoning, are at this time are Israel, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. And I don't need to, you know, go over with this group, the tensions that exist within that triangle. It's our job. It's our job, the job of the United States, that is, to present to those allies and to others as well. You know, Egypt, Jordan, the UAE, all of Bahrain, a general vision of order in the region, to come to an agreement bilaterally with each one of those states of how our relations are going to achieve that order, and then to be a kind of mediator and shock absorber between the other elements of the system.
All right, thank you. General Kimmitt, did you have any responses to what Mike said already?
No, but what Mike did do is cause me to think about something, which is the question, what will the U.S. do internally as a response to COVID-19, or what must the U.S. do in a response to the effect of COVID-19 in these very fragile states, whether it's Iran, whether it's Iraq, whether it's some of the other countries that inevitably will become more unstable, not simply because of COVID-19, but in the fall in oil prices that we're seeing that are kneecapping some countries like Iraq. I mean, Iraq right now doesn't have the ability with its budget to pay its workers, its government workers. And given that the fundamental argument of the protesters in Iraq has been, where's my government job? They're between COVID-19 and the oil prices. I mean, it's the perfect storm in those countries. And should the U.S. withdraw as a result, or should the U.S. double down as a requirement?
Okay. Mike?
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that was a question to me.
Based on his comments, I thought maybe you would have something, but let me move on to my list of questions. One of the things you actually already brought up, Mike, is the conflict potential for like Iran's position, Iran's weakening in the region. As you know, there have been, you know, sort of humanitarian arguments for giving Iran some sanctions relief in the COVID-19 environment. And then there are those who argue that this is actually the time to increase pressure on Iran. It's an opportune time. So what do you think about that dichotomy? And where do you land on that question?
I'm always very easy to predict on that question. I think the number one goal of the United States in the Middle East is to weaken Iran. I think that they are in the worst. The Islamic Republic is in the worst crisis in its history. There's no way it can turn this crisis around to its advantage. In the past, it has done so. You know, I think the second worst crisis it was in the 1980s due to the Iran-Iraq War. But they were able to use the war. They were able to use the war to mobilize population and eliminate pockets of anti-regime sentiment in the country. There's no way they can turn this around. I think they have really lost the legitimacy deficit is at the highest it's ever been. And so if we want to take the nuclear program away from this regime, or we want to reduce it to levels that we think are not threatening to us and our allies, if we want to weaken Iran in Syria, in Lebanon, and in Iraq, then this is a prime opportunity for us. And I think we should want those things. All the people who are calling for aid to Iran because of the coronavirus are the same people who were against sanctions before the coronavirus. If it's just a matter of humanitarian aid, medicine, medical equipment, and so on, there are all kinds of ways to get that to the Iranians without reducing the sanctions and relieving the pressure on the regime.
General Kimmitt.
Yeah, I would only make the point that here in Washington, we predicted 25 of the last falls of the Islamic Republic of Iran. We've always got it wrong. My touch point has always been, if we couldn't get Venezuela to fall, I don't think that we're in any position, nor is the Islamic Republic in any risk of crumbling anytime soon. Not that I think we should accept that as a given fact. I think we ought to continue to maintain the maximum pressure campaign, not to do or try to inspire regime change, but simply to get behavior change out of them. Now, that may be even harder than regime change, but I just don't see, after watching Venezuela and North Korea for so many years, that we have a chance of having an autocratic, totalitarian government like we see in Tehran getting overturned by the people. It's just.
Oh, I didn't mean to suggest that. I wasn't calling for a regime change, and I don't see any sign that that the regime is about to fall. But I do think that it's in the worst crisis it's been in, and it's weakened, and that it's being forced to take resources away from activities that are threatening to us, and devote them to simply trying to shore up its legitimacy at home, and that's a good thing for us.
Mike, they seem to have enough fuel for their speedboats and enough rocket fuel for their missile programs. So I would agree that they are having to divert funding from their people, but they don't seem to be unwilling to do that to continue their malign activities in the region, their missile program, or activities in the Persian Gulf that could lead to miscalculation. I think we end up in the same place. It's a very dangerous time for Iran right now. We need to watch it carefully. I wouldn't expect either an external explosion or an internal implosion anytime soon.
General, actually, my next question was going to be on this. Given the sort of recent tensions, at least at the rhetorical level, over Iranian boats harassing U.S. military in the Gulf, there was no serious retaliation after Soleimani's killing, and recent tensions seem to be milder, or at least remain at the rhetorical level. How do you see, and Rouhani said they wouldn't be the ones starting a conflict in the region. How do you see those ongoing tensions? Would it lead to any kind of serious conflict anytime soon?
Yeah, look, I mean, we've said this for a long time. The Iranian regime may be irrational, but they're not suicidal. When we killed Soleimani, and more importantly, killed Abu Mohandas, there was a potential for spiraling out of control. I'm no fan of the Iranian regime, but I thought that they acted fairly rationally by going after a couple of our bases, such as Al-Assad, and then backing off. But I don't think that that means it's over, because I think now, after they've done the formal retribution by the attack on Al-Assad base, it's clear to me they're continuing to fund, train, and direct Iranian militias around the region, most particularly inside of Iraq. I saw it on my last trip after Soleimani had been killed. And the destabilizing, they're just taking a different way to retaliate, one that's not as visible and one that's not as dramatic as they did after Al-Assad. But they're still continuing to take revenge on us, just in a different way.
Mike?
I think that's right, but I think it's important to realize that the United States has answered every one of the major Iranian initiatives to break the sanctions, and in doing so, it has reduced the range of action that the Iranians have in carrying out retribution against us and in putting pressure on us. I think that their strategy back in April of last year that they figured on was to raise the threat of war with the United States to such an extent that it would be a political liability to Donald Trump here at home. Their effort to do that, I think, was foiled at each turn. Not necessarily perfectly at each turn, but as the U.S. and Iran went back and forth, the U.S. showed an ability to raise the price to Iran for its behavior to such an extent that it had to go back to the kind of activities now that Mark just mentioned. Ones where it is not, where its hand cannot be directly seen, and where it is not able to create the impression in American domestic politics that Trump is taking the United States to war, which is what I think their goal was. And you see a similar dynamic in Lebanon between the Israelis and Hezbollah. You know, several months back, the Israelis carried out an operation in downtown Beirut, you know, in Hezbollah's heartland, and Nasrallah could make a lot of noise about it, but he did not carry out such a significant retaliation against Israel that it would actually lead to conflict. So I think Nasrallah is kind of in a box too. You notice after Qasem Soleimani was killed, Nasrallah gave a blood-curdling speech about how Americans were going to go home in body bags from the Middle East, but he made it very clear, explicit, and you know he took pains to say, but the arena of conflict is in Iraq. So in other words, I'm not part of this. Other people are going to be carrying out these operations. Now, from an American point of view, that's not ideal by any stretch of the imagination, and it doesn't mean that the Iranians have been totally deterred by the Qasem Soleimani strike, but it does mean that they have been their range of action has been seriously reduced.
If I could just make a quick response to that. I agree with Mike, but I think that we've got to recognize that there is this very almost scripted action counteraction process, which in my mind is very helpful to stability in the region. As you know, I spent a lot of time in Iraq, most of my time in Iraq, and it's very easy, whether we want to or not, for Iran to be listening in, either because the messages are relayed to them or other ways. But throughout the last 8 months, as they picked up their activities inside of Iraq, in particular, firing rockets around the green zone, outside of different facilities, the U.S., for which the Iraqis had responsibility for the protection, I kept warning the government officials and the military officials in Iraq, which is, don't confuse restraint with weakness. You can go ahead and make all this noise, but if you kill an American, there will be a response. And that's exactly what they saw. And to that extent, I think we've seen a little bit of red line drawing inside of Iraq. They kind of push, then they pull, then they push until they get a response to that. But now they've gone outside of Iraq for the moment, and it's what I call the 3 M's. The danger is there. the malign activities throughout the region. You see Zarif sitting down with Assad in inside of Syria. You see the malign activity. So that's the malign activities. You saw the unprecedented missile launch, which was significant because it demonstrated not simply that they have a ballistic missile capability, but now potentially an intercontinental ballistic missile capability. And they have upped the game inside the Persian Gulf, which this little speedboat bumping has been a significant opportunity for miscalculation. And I applaud the administration for sending back a very clear message that if you keep this up, you're pulling it out of the water. So they're probing. I actually think that the Soleimani killing was a one-off, and they see this as a continued effort at finding out the weak spots in the American strategy.
Thank you, General. I want to move on to Syria a little bit. As you all know, Israel continues some limited military operations in Syria. They're hitting Hezbollah positions in Syria. Turkey has a serious military presence. Russia is there. Russia cooperate on and off in Idlib. And there's US troops there controlling the oil well. But in this environment where economic toll of the COVID-19 is so high and the oil prices are so low, will it make sense for the US to continue to be there? Will Trump make another pull-out decision, saying that it's not worth being there? Mike?
Well,
Yeah.
I don't know that the real pressure that is being felt these days is as Mark was describing, is more in Iraq than in Syria. Our presence in Syria has been relatively cost-free. What I would like to have seen in Syria, but I don't think we're going to see it, and certainly not before the election, was greater support for Turkey in Idlib. To backstop the Turks against the possibility of Russian aggression. I argued back when the U.S. pulled back from northeast Syria under pressure from the Turks that it was important to maintain the relationship with Turkey because it could be a counterbalance to the Russian-Iranian alliance. To me, the lesson of the last round of fighting in Idlib is that is indeed the case. There are areas where Turkey is cooperating with Russia, but there are lots of areas where there's significant friction, and that friction works to the advantage of the United States. And I think it provides a basis for beginning to arrive at a common strategic picture. This is what's been missing, or it's the first step that's missing in terms of improving U.S.-Turkish relations, is for Ankara and Washington to come to at least a common picture of what we're up against in the region. If not a totally shared picture, at least at least a partially shared picture where we can discuss the issues that where we can discuss amicably and productively the issues that we don't completely agree on.
General, do you have any comments on that?
Not really. Mike and I are probably the only two people in Washington, D.C. that seriously argued the merits of the U.S. forces being withdrawn from Syria. So I would just echo Mike's comment. But I can't, for the life of me, see why we're going to maintain American soldiers to protect those oil fields now when oil is running at barely the price of a six-pack of Coke per barrel.
Yeah. Okay, so I would like to move on to questions. There's several questions. Mike, there was a question about your earlier comments about building a coalition of states, including Turkey, to help preserve the U.S. interests in the region. it seems to me that this is highly unlikely because there are so many issues that keep these allies far from each other rather than closer. Turkey is closer to Russia in Syria, and Saudi Arabia, together with the UAE, have been accused of playing with the stability of Turkey. What would you say to that?
Uh, there's no there's no strategic concept you can have about the Middle East that doesn't have a serious contradiction in it. You know, there's no idea that the U.S. could come up with that would make sense in the same way to each one of its allies. You have to treat each area of the Middle East, you know, as the United States, as a superpower with interests all across the region. You have to treat each area as its kind of own sphere. I mean, I'm saying, you know, the Gulf, the Eastern Med, the Northern Middle East, and so on, and then find ways to link them all together. So what you're doing when you try to make a regional strategy is you're choosing which contradictions you want to try to deal with. That's what it's all about, choosing the contradictions. So yes, there's going to be conflict between serious disagreements between Turkey, Israel, and Saudi Arabia, but that's inherent in our relations there anyway. So to me, it's not an argument against the idea. What I'm arguing against are those people in Washington who are saying that the U.S.-Turkish relationship is a thing of the past, or it's not worth investing in, or it's all of the tensions that we have with Turkey are the result of actions by the Turks and short-sightedness by the Turks. I think we need to get back to seeing the major states in the region as the primary interlocutors and the primary agents of our strategy. And you just need to look at the capabilities that Turkey displayed in Idlib in this last round of fighting to realize how important it is to do that.
Thank you. General, do you have comments on that?
No, I'd like to hear some other audience questions.
Sure. Okay, so how can you comment? This is Alexander Hoffman from Strategicon Center, Russia. How can you comment on the development of Russian-American rivalry in northeastern Syria in the context of a pandemic?
Mike?
Well, I would just continue along the lines of what I was saying, and there's something of, I don't want to overstate this case, but there's something of a return, or there's movement in the direction of a return to the kind of system we had in the 1980s, where Russia and Syria were supporting the PKK against Turkey, and the United States was then supporting Turkey against the PKK. Now, that's a ridiculous simplification, but the tensions that have emerged since the U.S. pulled back, or that have been highlighted since the U.S. pulled back between Russia and Turkey, I think show that this idea that a lot of people have in Washington that Turkey is now solidly in the Russian camp and working against U.S. interests is just overly simplistic.
Thank you. There's another question. Do you think Turkey is a reliable partner to disrupt China's One Belt, One Road in Central Asia and the Middle East?
I guess I would have to ask the fundamental premise of the need to disrupt the Belt and Road Initiative. It's kind of like this foolish notion that we've got to stop the land route between Iran and Syria. I mean, there are 15 different ways that the Iranians can continue their activities without going through the center of Baghdad to do that. The Belt and Road Initiative, if that's seen as a bumper sticker for increasing Chinese influence of all types in the region, in fact, if he'd asked the question in light of COVID, I think that we're going to see the Chinese try to overcompensate for the mistakes they made at the beginning of COVID, not only being the source of it, but also as they tried to demonstrate the humanitarian actions by sending equipment that was either faulty or didn't work. So they're going to try to overcompensate for that. But the Belt and Road Initiative is a subset of a larger plan and longer term plan of China to establish themselves in a major way, the way the United States has and the way that England, Great Britain had in the last century. So I don't think the solution to that question is as simplistic as people would say, but I also would just suggest that this notion of a Chinese monolith that is inexorably taking over large parts of the earth is just incorrect. They've got far more internal problems, I would say, than even places such as Iran. And I don't think we need to be afraid of the Chinese. I think we just need to be able to outsmart the Chinese and in some cases outspend the Chinese. So but it goes back to your fundamental question. Where does Turkey fit into that? And that's really up to Turkey. Again, this notion that Turkey can either be China's friend or America's friend, I think is a false question in the first place. And the whole issue of friends is a false model in the second place. Turkey is going to do what's in Turkey's interest, and they're going to pick and choose among their interests and among their allies. So I don't think that there's anything other than and I guess I'm rambling on, but what I think I'm trying to suggest is no matter how we improve our formerly very strong relationships with Turkey, it's not a zero-sum game. More co-sharing of interests with the Turks does not mean less co-sharing of Turkey's interests with China. So I think we just need to fight it, or I should say, I think we just need to figure out how to compete with that. And Turkey plays a part in that, but Turkey has interests of its own that we can't control, and making demands is something that would be foolish in this case.
I think that last statement of Marx is the key one, where he said figuring out how to compete. We have a lot of really hard intellectual work to do in the coming years even, in better defining for ourselves the nature of the competition that we're in with China, and deciding what the arena, where the major arenas are in which we're going to pursue that competition. The Chinese, take for instance commercial drones. The Chinese dominate the commercial drone market in the Middle East. They adopted that position, or they achieved that position, I don't think with any competition from the United States. And the U.S., as far as I know, I'm hesitate before I say this, but I don't think we have a clear policy on it at all. I would think that that's an area where we and our allies would actually want to be competing with the Chinese. But at this stage, there's no policy. So once we have it clearer in our minds of what the nature of the competition with the Chinese is, well, then perhaps there is a significant role for U.S. Turkish relations in that competition. But I do agree with Mark. I mean, there's no look at China is now the #1 trade partner with Saudi Arabia, which is also an ally with the United States. There's no way that the United States can stop its allies in the region from having productive relations with China in many areas, particularly economic. The key for us is to decide where are our red lines with regard to China, and how are we going to impose those red lines, and who can be the best allies with us in doing that. But I also wonder, and this is another area where I just don't know. I mean, again, there's some very serious intellectual work that has to be done, but I think that this issue of supply chains out of China is a serious one. And we're going to want to, we allowed so much of our industrial product to move to, or industrial production to move to China without thinking about the strategic implications. And I would think that we would now want to diversify that, move a lot of that back to the United States where possible, but maybe turn to other partners. And I wonder if Turkey actually, in a number of areas, couldn't be a very vital partner for the United States. I know Trump has put out the $100 billion number in bilateral trade. It seems to me that $100 billion number, which we've always known as aspirational, and as much a statement of goodwill and intentions as a real, true aim. But in light of the rising competition with China, I don't see why that number shouldn't, why our aspiration shouldn't be redoubled.
Thank you, Mike. You've already answered two questions I had. One was about China. You know, that was because of Trump's additional tariffs. Already some production were moving to other Asian countries. Sometimes they were simply Chinese companies, but relocating or putting a stamp on another country. But in the wake of the COVID-19, we saw that US had such a hard time producing some of the medical supplies, and Turkey kept producing, and they've also exported some to the US as well. The other question was about China's sort of what arenas, what countries in the region that US would compete with China, but I think you both answered that. One last question, perhaps. Elections, obviously, November, a Biden administration, potential theoretical Biden administration. How would that affect US Middle East policy, do you think?
I'll take on that one first. A quick aside to this notion of patriotic repatriation of our supply chains. You know, I think that's going to last for about a year. I think that everybody's waving the flag right now and saying we need to get this done because we can't be dependent upon Chinese supply chains. A year from now, Wall Street and the owners of these companies are going to start pushing hard for higher profits, and they're going to make the same decisions, in my mind, that they made when they started moving factories out of Middletown and into the middle of China. The economic pressure to squeeze, the very nature of the capitalist system is to squeeze as much profit as you can, and if it can't be made here, that's the fundamental nature of free trade. What was your last question, though? Because I wanted to answer. Biden. Look, Mike can correct me and can add to it, but I think we're just going to see Obama redux. The very same people that we saw running around during the Obama administration, running the foreign policy establishment, the defense establishment, my sensing is by and large they'll be coming back. In the Middle East, I think we're going to see the same mistake made by the Biden administration on day one that the Obama administration did, which is they're going to try to, they're not only going to try to reestablish the climate agreement that we have with the rest of the world, but I think they're going to crawl back to Tehran and try to patch together the JCPOA again. That would be, and then try to deal with the consequences of what that means, the second and third order effects of what that means to our Arab allies and our Israeli allies in the region. They seem to, you know, this crowd was the one that negotiated it, and I also think it's going to be the crowd that tries to bring it back in the interests of the world.
I basically agree with that analysis. Just make one little footnote to it, which is that I do think that that Trump has destroyed a large number of the arguments that the Obama team made for the thawing of relations with Iran, or for the JCPOA. You know, arguments such as we can't continue the sanctions regime because the rest of the world won't let us, and we'll be isolated in the world if we do that, and the sanctions will fray. And there was a general elevation of the Iranian threat. You remember the choice that we supposedly faced was between continuing the sanctions, which were going to erode, and war with Iran. And I think Trump has shown, Trump better than you know any president that I can remember has understood the true size of the Iranian problem. Iran is a serious threat to the interests of the United States in the region. It's the most serious threat. It has real capabilities, and it can cause us a lot of damage, and it can erode our alliances if we don't pay attention to what Iran is up to. But we are significantly stronger than the Iranians. I mean, they benefit from our inattention to the conflict, which they're focused on all the time. So what's really hard, and I think you saw this in the back and forth between me and Mark at the beginning, it's really hard to address the strengths of the Iranian regime without making them sound like, without making it sound like you think they're stronger than they actually are, and the weaknesses without making it sound like you think that they're nothing or about to collapse and so on. They have very serious capabilities which can cause us pain, but we are also a lot stronger than they are. And I think,
Mike, I would only make one comment. I don't think it's an issue of strong or weak. It's an issue of resilient. And you can be strong and resilient. You can be weak and resilient. But Iran is resilient.
No, sure, certainly it's resilient. I'm not trying to go back and forth with you on that issue anymore. I was just trying to make the point that I think Trump has taught American public opinion a lesson about the power differential. And so if the reason I'm saying that is that if Biden comes back in and wants to just go back to the JCPOA, I think it will be obvious to a lot of people that we have more options, that isn't what we have to do. And we have more options and more leverage over Iran than the Obama administration led us to believe that we had. But I do agree with Mark that that the basic picture of the Middle East that Biden has is the Obama picture, and that's the one that's very distrustful of our traditional allies, Israel, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia, and very desirous of the outreach to Tehran. As crazy as I think that sounds, that's the way they see the world.
Thank you.
Believe and willing to believe that people will change their behavior by good acts on our part.
Right.
Right.
There's one more question, but that's about something that I raised. The question is, do we have confirmation that the medical supplies Turkey sent to the US have started to be used? I remember that the testing kits were seeking FDA approval a couple of weeks ago, but I'm unsure if they've been approved and now in distribution. I honestly don't know if, that procedure, how it works, but Turkey has been sending to some medical supplies to some 50 countries, including the US. That was my point about Mike brought up production base, sort of shifting away from China, Turkey as a possibility. In that context, I brought it up. But if anybody knows if they've got the FDA approval. FDA approves these things pretty fast these days, I guess, because of the emergency situation, but I don't know specifically.
Fast is relative for FDA approval.
Exactly. I just want to allow you to, okay, one more question. How do you assess the threat of social destabilization in Jordan caused by the aftermath of the pandemic and possible U.S. actions?
That's one for Mark. I'm
Yeah.
I'm out of touch.
Again, people have predicted the fall of the Hashemite kingdom for years and years, and it seems to be, even though the quote Jordanians, the Hashemites, are a very small minority inside of Jordan, they've been amazingly resilient, primarily because whether it's the Iraqi expats or the Palestinian expats, revolution may sound good in the coffee houses, but they know they've got a much better deal inside of Jordan than they could get anywhere else in the region. So I think it's something that always needs to be kept in mind. But I think that sane groups inside of Jordan that are not part of the family understand that let's not cut our nose off to spite our face.
Thank you, General. If you have additional comments, I want to give you a moment for that, but otherwise we'll end here.
No, I just always enjoy being with Mike Doran. He's one of the smartest guys I know, and he's one of the most enjoyable people to be around when we're not in the think tank mode. And I got a lot of respect for his intellect and his writings.
Thank you so much, General. Thank you very much, Mike.
Thank you, and I share all of those sentiments. I'm really a fantastic person to be around, and the more you can do it, the better.
That's why we have you.
That's why we have you, Mike.
Thank you so much for being part of this discussion, this webinar on the U.S. policy in the Middle East in the age of coronavirus. As I mentioned at the beginning, we will continue organizing these webinars on the U.S. foreign policy, U.S. global role going forward. Keep following us. Please join me in thanking our panel virtually. You could clap. We won't hear it, but thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Kadir. It was a pleasure being here.
Thank you.
You.
A real pleasure.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye.